Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, where we're going to be talking about designing and developing miniature war games. I'm Mike Hutchinson, a games designer, and I'm here with Glenn Ford, also a games designer. Glenn, what are we going to be talking about today?
So today I thought we would talk about the rather highfalutin idea of our process in designing a game. So we're going to, for the first half, talk about literally how we go from idea fuzzing around in your head to some sort of finalized product, whether it ends up being a box game or a book for a miniatures war game. And then hopefully in the second half, we'll talk maybe a little bit more specifically. I'll hold forth on my experience of having successfully kickstarted some games. And Mike, you'll tell us about the mysterious art of pitching to publishers and actually getting picked up.
The mysterious art of crippling rejection letters.
Deal with rejection after soul hammering rejection.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah. Brilliant. So, so to crack off on that first part, I'll ask you, Mike, how do you filter the clamorous voices of ideas that are no doubt constantly in your brilliant mind down into the very first stages of controlling them towards some sort of product?
So I have a lot of exciting ideas for games, have them quite regularly, and I write them down in my little ring-bound notebook, which I'm sure most designers will have one of. And I tend to, when I have an idea that I'm excited about, that's just at the very, very conceptual stages, I'll grab a fresh page of my notebook, I'll write a title and a date, and I will just jot down whatever it is that I'm excited about. And quite often I'll phrase that as a question to myself. Like what if there was a war game which didn't have turns but had acts like in a play, and that'll be the opening statement of the page, and then I'll sort of just slam down a bunch of bullet points, probably half garbled, and I actually learned from Glenn that having erasable pens is kind of a fun thing. You might wonder why not just use a pencil, but pencils smudge over time in your notebook, I find. So the beginning of my process is always throwing down whatever it is that was sort of getting me excited about a game idea. Quite often that's a concept, like a high concept for like, here's a thing that I can mess with. Sometimes it's a mechanic. So a couple of times I've sort of started a page about like, okay, how are we going to do like a combat game or a fighting game or a dueling game? And I've got some idea about how that's going to work. And then normally that's enough. Like that page of notes will either, that will be the sort of demon expelled and I'll never have to look at it again, or maybe I'll bump into it later. Or it starts to claw at my mind, and the next day when I'm in the shower, I start to get the next questions or the next ideas. And so at that point, it begins to go into the next stage. Is that, Glenn, is that how you expel the initial demon as well, roughly?
So I've got a ring binder, and there's the first page of it is a page of A4. And what an idea the idea gets 1 to maximum 2 lines of that page of A4, and it needs to, and I explain it out in those 2 lines, and then that list always goes back on the shelf. However excited I am about the idea, it goes into that list, and then that ring binder goes back on the shelf, and a few weeks later at most, it comes back down, and if I can still remember what the idea was and what was interesting or exciting about it off of those 2 lines, then it might get an opportunity to go on to the next stage. And every few months, I go through that list and I cross off anything that hasn't worked or come out or just sounds silly or I can't remember what it was. And whenever that list gets past a single side of A4, it gets re-edited out and things get scrubbed and it gets cut down to about 3/4 of a page. And that's how I think I said to you, hopefully as a games designer, ideas are cheap. Development is where the sweat is. You know, turning it from that first idea to something that goes somewhere is the hard work. And so, you know, if you have an idea, you have a concept, and sometimes a couple of those ideas get mashed together. Sometimes one of them goes out to be like a paragraph of mechanics. So sometimes it'll be an idea, oh, that's not going to support a full game, but that mechanical idea was a good idea. So that gets pulled out, it gets turned into a paragraph of mechanics, and that goes on to like, so the next few pages in that folder are literally sort of a paragraph or two of a mechanical idea or an explanation of a sentence, which was never going to carry its own game, but is a neat little thing, and that gets written down just in case it gets used. And sometimes when I go and talk about this in a second, we go to the sort of the prototype stage. After a little while, a game hasn't worked as a prototype; it gets broken back down again. Sometimes it goes back to being one of those paragraphs, because I've talked to people on Board Game Geek and forums and such like, and they've realized an idea isn't working, and they say, okay, is that it? Is that months of work just down the drain? It's never wasted time, I think, developing something. You can always, if it was worth putting those months in, there's something there that you can salvage back out again.
Yeah, and quite often, whatever problem you were wrestling with, you'll end up bumping into just reskinned or rethemed in another game. I'm really interested. So just tell me a little bit more about why you force distance between your initial excitement and starting to develop the idea any further. Surely you should dive in whilst the passion is running wild. Why do you put that distance in?
I mean, it's funny enough, if you know the sitcom writer Graham Linehan wrote The IT Crowd and Black Books. Whenever he has an idea, he has apparently a drawer in his desk that locks. And when he has an idea, he writes it down and he puts it into that desk drawer, and he locks the desk drawer, and then he goes away again, and that desk drawer never gets opened to be read through, apart from like, and he's, you know, a bigger deal and more disciplined. He goes back to that drawer like every 3 months or something, he says, and it has to survive that initial excitement to being something. I guess it's because the process of working a game all the way through is a cold hell sometimes, and you need to, writing is rewriting. The first version, the first spew of ideas, I generally don't have a lot of difficulty holding the framework that I would splurge out onto a piece of paper in my head for sort of quite a period of time. And personally, a lot of my process is doing a lot of work and then going away and then coming back and finding out that the back brain has kind of chewed through a lot of the ore to spit something out, and then, you know, splurging that out again. And I find that if I do something and then keep pushing it, I very quickly get to a point where all the smart things have gone, and the sort of the sub brain needs to work it over. And
so I think this might be a learning style difference. So if I'm excited about something, I will very, very quickly get it to playable prototype. And by playable prototype, I mean like horrible rubbish nonsense. But having put it on the table and having pushed it around, like the physicality of that act, even if it's very simple and early in the design, is what cements the system in my mind. So having conceived of it's not enough. I need to have felt it out physically on the table. And once I do that, then I can step away from it. So we should talk about prototyping.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, for me, there's a sort of a bit of because I go through this process of a basic idea, that I think the first step for me often with prototyping anything is whether it's a physical box game or a skirmish miniatures game, it's writing out the rules in sort of one complete chunk. And again, I think generally with prototyping, again, I talk to a lot of sort of first-time designers or people who haven't designed a game yet. And there's so much value in that first shoddy, doesn't really work prototype, primarily because there are those moments, and I don't know if you come across this sometimes, where in your head, everything ticks through and it's all clockwork and you do this and then that. And then you physically write it down and you suddenly go, oh, just a minute, that thing's here at that moment, it can't also be over there. And you literally physically go, oh right, yeah, I wasn't genuinely holding it all in my skull.
Yeah, no,
I was
this is so true. Like, having thought about this, because it's happened to me a lot, it's almost like you dream of a good game, and in dream reality it's a great game and everything clicks together and you're like, I'm a super genius, this is amazing. And then you put it in front of another human and they just go, but there's three wheels and one of them's on the roof, and you're like, oh god, you're right, oh yes, let's fix that, let me go away and be less horrible at game design.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy to get focused in on all of the separate bits of your game, as they're all sort of little beautiful disjointed things lying around the table. And unless you're a lot smarter than I am, you really can't click them all together. You can't genuinely build the machine entirely in your head and whole. I mean, hopefully you're, to be honest, I mean, I imagine there's some games that's simple enough where you can, but if your game is of any level of complexity, I don't think you can, it's like it's like you can see what's in your peripheral vision, but you can't really see what's in your peripheral vision. You're just kind of imagining vaguely that there's a connection there, and you need to actually sort of turn your head to it.
So another aspect of prototyping which I'm interested in. So I do this a lot because I'm lazy, or because I want to find out what the interesting thing is. So particularly with miniature skirmish games, quite often I'll be exploring an idea that I'm excited about, and that might be a narrative or a thematic idea, or it might be a mechanical idea that I think is interesting. And quite often my prototype will just borrow a bunch of existing mechanics that I already understand, and so I kind of start with a scaffolding, or I just need like a shooting resolution system right now because I wasn't excited about that part of the game, but like two things are going to shoot each other. Okay, I'll just do the normal thing that I do, or I'll do the last game that I played. I'm interested. Does that work for sort of board game design as well? Do you just go, oh, I don't know what the tableau thing is, I'll just borrow that from another game? Or is that one of the differences between prototyping perhaps a miniatures and tape measures game versus something that's a bit more of an abstracted board game?
I think that for a board game, there are a lot of mechanics where you can sort of have a mental placeholder. So okay, there's going to be a discard pile and there's going to be a draw stack, and they're going to do, it's going to do the normal Dominion deck build a bit there, and then you can fit the other stuff around it. I think the huge difference with prototyping a board game is, unsurprisingly, all the components, where a fairly simple board game is going to have whatever 50 cards, and you've got to physically sort of create those cards, and they're going to have to interact. And for me, that's one of the things where I really need to prototype a board game, whereas I don't, so when I'm writing out a miniatures war game, the important point is those bits where in the rules where you say see page blah blah, and you then actually have to write page blah blah and make sure that the two of them actually interact with each other in an intelligent way. Because when they're in my head, they're all separate entities, and then when I write them down, I suddenly realize, oh, just a minute, this phase doesn't work unless that phase does something, or that phase doesn't click unless that phase does something. When prototyping a board game, it's much more a case of, okay, so I need 50, generally in your head, it's like, okay, I need 50 cards that do roughly X, but slightly different from each other in an interesting way. And then physically prototyping out all of those 50 cards is often writing the bulk of the actual game. And the rules I find that in board games, the rules come a lot later, a lot of the time.
Right, so you build the component library in front of you, and you sort of know what they're supposed to do, but the rule book, it's sort of the last thing to come in, because really you're just moving the components around for a while.
I think a lot of the time for a board game, the rules are how I explain to you how the game is meant to be played. Because once I've figured out all the components, I hopefully know how the game is being played anyway, if I'm just on my own. And you want to get onto the rule book as early as possible for board game, because it is it's always the hardest part of the writing process. It makes your head bleed. But it is ultimately, I think, that with a skirmish game, the rule book sort of creates the game. I can't just play a skirmish game without the rule book, really. But I can play the board. I mean, if you think of the way you physically play board games, hopefully you don't play board games and card games with the rule book open at the table. You know, you
the
hopefully
components need to do a lot
rules.
of the work of communicating and reminding you.
Yeah,
how the system clicks.
You generally internalize the rules and then you play the game. Whereas with most skirmish war games, and I don't think it's a thing about complexity, I think it's just the nature of the thing, is that unless you're very, very experienced with a sort of a miniatures game, you'll tend to have that book open at the table
at
sort of
point,
almost all the time, because that's the nature of the beast. Where the board game, there's so much sort of information on the cards, and there's so much interaction is within the cards that you need to get them physically made sort of as early as possible.
So we should talk a little bit about the practicalities of prototyping. So it is a little bit different, as you suggest, for a board game and a miniatures game. Although I do tend to prototype quite a lot of quick reference components because I'm lazy and I want, for example, recently with Mystic Skies, the little spell cards, which aren't really needed but were like quick references, I made them almost the first day that I was playing the game, because I laid the game out, I got the miniatures out, and I was like, what do my spells do? And I wanted to have them laid out in front of me. But in terms of the practicalities, I suppose it's interesting because the two of us, the two of you and you, we've got slightly different approaches technologically, because I come from a graphic design, somewhat of a graphic design background, and I'm very confident with Photoshop and Illustrator and all kinds of whizzy bits and bobs, whereas you're a ring-bound sort of squared paper and an erasable pen kind of a guy, and I think the point is that neither is more or less effective than the other. It's whatever tool we feel like most efficient and comfortable with. I like using the digital tools because I can throw out some some cards for a unit, or I can lay out some templates really fast. I can save them. I know that I'm not going to lose them, and that kind of helps my process. But you presumably enjoy the fact that you can just get things in front of you and rub them out and mess about.
Yeah, I mean, even when I'm working on sort of a game like Gaslands or something, I'll print out all of the rules, even when it's in an early version, and I'll make my adjustments on it with a pen, rather than and then type it all up into the computer. And that's just a thing about, I think that you have to be comfortable sort of when you're doing creative work about the way that the idea comes from your head to the physical thing. And sometimes you'll find sitting in front of a computer and sort of gazing off into the distance and then typing things out. And sometimes you need to sort of, I need to have a pen and a bit of paper and scribble things and have just pieces of paper with random deranged notes on them written upside down in sort of scroll.
He'll sometimes give to me, people.
Yeah, it's I think certainly early on in the days of Gaslands, I didn't sort of type anything up, and Mike just got reams and reams of handwritten,
handwritten lined paper just shoved in unsorted through my letterbox.
There you go. There's ideas. Have ideas.
I had to number the pages and staple them myself, and then file them in the big missives from Glenn folder. I think that is a really important point, though, that you should, as a games designer, you must feel empowered to just use whatever tool and practice suits your brain. There is no correct tooling for prototyping, and there's no correct tooling for the development stage. I actually really I tend to work digitally quite a lot, so I'll do a lot of my editing and sort of thought expulsion straight into Google Docs. But when it comes to, but I will quite often print off even really early drafts and get a pen and go and sit on the sofa and like not be at my computer and not be distracted, because there's just a different kind of thinking that happens with that. And indeed, sometimes I will print a copy off and then carry it out of the door and go for a walk and sort of pull it out of my back pocket occasionally and scrawl something indecipherable on it, because you just need to keep changing the environment and changing your sort of your stance and your relationship with the text in front of you, to try and shake things down from the tree.
Okay, so you've got a first prototype version, a version of the game which physically can be played, and I don't know if you're saying the first version gets played solo. It gets played solo a lot in my head, just running it through, going, does that work? Does that break down? Then the physical thing gets made, and the physical thing gets played solo a handful of times just to make sure that the wheels don't just immediately fall off and it all goes when the cogs all hit each other in the wrong shape. I suppose a big question that a lot of people ask is, when do you first show it to another human being?
Really early, like much earlier than you're comfortable with. Because of that dream state that we discussed earlier, the number of times that I have thought I had something amazing and then shown it to a human and they have pointed out that it is flawed, horribly flawed, is like it's an incredibly regular occurrence. And so I think that the secret is to show it to another human as soon as possible. And there is a bit of a caveat there, which is that you need to balance being sure of the purpose of your design, and the showing it to humans to find out whether it's got its legs attached to its head or not. By which I mean, the earlier you show it, the sooner you're going to realize whether you've got anything there at all, and you're going to start not sort of moving from the hypothetical design stage to the actual design stage. But there is a stage where you might not know how to take feedback yet, because you don't know what the game is trying to do yet, and you sort of it's so embryonic that you don't know whether the feedback is relevant or not, and you should always be in a position to understand whether the feedback's relevant or not, because people will just say things to you.
And I think this is, I genuinely want to sort of at a later point do a whole sort of half hour on this, talking about the nature of the relationship with playtesters and designers, and when you need to. And I think it's we really need to talk about it, particularly I think in relation to Gaslands and other things, is the things you know that you need to fight for and the things that you need to sort of open up to other people.
But you're right, that's sort of slightly later in the development process, whereas that initial moment where you've the very, very first paper prototype in front of you, you've played it twice yourself, it seems to hang together, you think it might be fun, there's something that's exciting you about it. I think that's the moment where you have to show it to somebody else, because they will immediately burst your bubble of whether there is anything fun here. One of my very earliest experiences of designing a sort of Settlers of Catan rip-off that was about early bobbies in London trying to chase criminals around. I showed it to somebody who wasn't even a mad board game fan, but had played a reasonable amount, and he just immediately saw the system and was just like, oh well, there's just one obvious choice at every point, this isn't really a game. And I was like, oh no, I'll never be a games designer. But actually what I hadn't realized at that point was that that's the most critical moment. You just have to do that super early, because somebody will point at the obvious flaw and you'll go, right, let's start designing a game.
I think you wrote a blog, and I think it's very true, is don't keep it secret, show it to somebody else as early as soon as there's something to show to somebody else, show it to another human being, hopefully somebody whose opinion you trust, and at later points there'll be a blind testing round and opening it to the general public, but try and find a person you trust and show it to them as soon as there's something that hangs together as any kind of an entity, I think. So you've got your prototype. I think for myself, it's always the two questions are usually, is there something here, something that it's worth digging down to? And B, is this fun? Because the thing I personally, I always struggle to judge in my own designs is where the fun is a lot of the time, because I think that,
or maybe not even is this fun, but it's like, could this be fun?
yeah,
Does this look like it's pointing in a fun direction?
Well, I think it's like a lot of the time you put the first thing down, you go, okay, look, this bit here, hold that to one, put a pin in that. This bit there, put a pin in that. That bit there was that bit there and that moment of fun or interest. Because if that isn't fun or interesting, and I think we'll come back to this. There's an important thing about knowing which of the bits really needs to work. Because I think a lot of the time in most designs, there's a whole bunch of scaffolding that needs to work and is important, but if it works in a different way or it works with a different system, and then there's usually a heart of the game. There's the spine of it, there's the central part, and it's like, okay, that needs to work, and that needs to work in pretty much this kind of way. Otherwise, there's no point bothering with all the rest of the scaffolding. All the rest of the scaffolding is just going to be holding up something that that isn't the point of what we're doing here.
That's interesting, and I think you and I have maybe a slight divergence of opinion on this particular topic, but it feels like it might be a totally separate thing. But yeah, just to put a pin in the fact that I think that there are central ideas or feelings or narratives or concepts that I want to preserve and hero, but the way that they are implemented systemically or in the rules, I sort of feel like should always be open for later revision. And you should sort of never have any darling that can't be killed, even if it's one of the central ideas. Because I've had a couple of personal experiences where what I thought was the central idea ended up being eclipsed by a bunch of other incredibly much more fun ideas, and then the thing that I thought was important in the early stages turned out to be just an appendix. But anyway, that's a separate thing. So we have a prototype that we've showed to a human. Let's do we assume at this point that we have discovered fun and we want to move to the next stage?
I mean, hopefully, because yes, there's a lot of prototypes and ideas that crash and burn at that stage, and you will find out sometimes that your idea is just not fun, and it just happens to not be. And what the thing that you thought was interesting and intriguing just doesn't come out, and it's just an absolute pain, sort of going through the process, dig down to it.
Do you just make, this is a theoretical question, does one just make one prototype?
I mean, you go through multiple. So I mean, when I make a physical prototype of a box game, literally I get out a deck of playing cards, and I get plain stickers, and I stick them on, and I physically write on them with erasable pens, and then they get erased and rewritten, sometimes in the middle of a play test, until the little label won't take it anymore, and then a new prototype gets physically made, and everything, and then I remake the whole thing. Lots of people do it on a computer and print it out and sort of run it that way. If you've got card sleeves, bunch of random old magic cards or whatever with slits of paper in front of them, that's a great way to prototype. I don't personally make, I suppose, I don't know if what you mean is, if an idea goes off on two divergent paths, do you make a prototype for each of those divergent paths?
No, I suppose that's not, maybe, I mean, I suppose one of the things that's unclear to me is where in my process I move from I am prototyping to I am in an early development iteration. Because for me, it's just a continuous, particularly because I'm writing miniature war games where, as we've said, it's mostly just about a document that explains the rules. Like, that document gets written in a terrible first version, which is essentially the prototype, and then it might get added to and added to and added to, and then rewritten, and then maybe thrown away, and I'll start a clean copy. And so a game like A Billion Suns, I have two completely different games that predated A Billion Suns. So the very first version of Billion Suns is called Star Killer, and it's got templates and there's a rule book for it, and that kind of got iterated and iterated and iterated, and then I threw it away and I started a new one that was called Leviathans, and that's got slightly different thing, and it's got the silhouette system, and that that was a rule book that started at 4 pages and maybe got to 8 or 12, and then I threw that away and I started again from scratch. But I guess at no point was I sort of saying, this is a prototype, this is an early version of the game that I'm now in development phase of. And I guess my point is, it doesn't matter. There is no arcane special property of a prototype. It's just how early and disposable and cheaply was it made, and you should try and keep as disposable and cheap as for as long as possible, I think, because then you aren't, if you go out and pay illustrators and graphic designers to create something really beautiful that is essentially just a prototype, and then you pay money to get that printed, like, you're now holding on to this thing that just might be terrible. Like, these might be bad parts of your game, but you've accidentally become wedded to them for some physical reason. So I would say, keep nimble and cheap and disposable for as long as possible. And I think that's where prototyping and developing really are kind of inseparable for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's sort of, there's sort of a philosopher's axe thing about prototypes sometimes, is that, you replace the handle of it and then you replace the head of it, and is it the same thing anymore? And I think sometimes you get your first prototype and then you pull a bit out and you shove a bit in, then you pull a bit out and you shove a bit in, and sometimes the bit you pull out and shove in is the main title of it, and sometimes it's the entire body of the thing. And when does that become a new prototype? I suppose
it doesn't matter, because no one's counting and no one cares.
No.
Like, it's.
And I think if you've got prototype 1 and then you change it so severely that it becomes prototype 2, and then you take prototype 1 and you put it back on the shelf, and you think, I might come back to that. That's still an idea. It's just a different idea, but this is the way this is going. Then I think you've got 2 prototypes. I think if you take prototype 1 and you just go, I mean, at best I'll archive it, this is just a worse version of that, then I think you go into the stage. But I agree.
As a slight aside, it might be worth just mentioning this. So, because I come from a world of software development, like, the versioning numbers of software matters. They have a semantic, and I have sort of borrowed some of that for my own internal numbering. So, because I'm working digitally, because I'm working in a Word document, I always number my versions. And when I increment the number is sort of an arbitrary decision that I just, like, I sit down and I'm feeling, freshly caffeinated, and so I'm like, right, it's time to increment the version number. Or I get to the end of an edit session, I'm like, whew, okay, that was actually kind of bigger than I was expecting. I'm going to increment the version number. And it particularly becomes important when you're doing public beta testing, where you really have to let the beta testers know whether they've got an incremented document or not. But I suppose one thing that helps with this discussion is, there's an idea in software between major software versions and minor software versions. So version 1, version 1.1, version 1.2, version 2.0. So version 1, 2, 3 is like major changes to the way that the functionality of the thing works, and people who encounter it may or may not even recognize it as some of the same thing, whereas the sort of decimal point versions are just little fixes and increments on something that basically is the same. And I use that in my own versioning systems to sort of both remind myself, but also give myself the sort of psychological freedom to say, I am now moving from thing worked like this to thing actually works like this. And so a recent example was Mystic Skies, which had a couple of really fundamental shifts in the way that the game functioned. And each time I would take a part of the game and say, actually, I'm going to tear this whole movement system out. I'm going to put this whole separate idea in. Like, that's when I say to myself, okay, we're moving from version 2 to version 3. Or I took out the entire, like, when we reached the point in the game where we said, maybe spells are automatically cast. Maybe there's no like casting dice system anymore. Boom. Okay, now moving from version 3 to version 4. And that allows me to, at least mentally, because I'm doing it digitally, take version 3, put it on the shelf and say, we know that was a game that functioned, and version 3 can still exist, and I can always pull it down at any point I like. I'm now working on version 4, and I can make a mess of version 4, and I can get all the toys back out and spread everything around and build that up. So although versioning doesn't matter, except when you're telling other people about which copy of the PDF they've got, it for me is actually quite a useful mental tool.
Okay, so hopefully at that point you've taken your initial splurge of ideas. You've found a process that refines them down through, I think, stages and levels of a private process, and then an early physical or at least sort of shareable version of the game that you get other people to look at. Hopefully the next stage from there, I think, is where we're going to a point of taking out into the public sphere, looking at sharing it more widely. And I think for me so far, that's been going through the kickstarting process, and for you, it's been in largely pitching. So I think it's a good idea to sort of move on to talking a little bit about those two processes for the two of us. So if you're watching this on YouTube, we'll put a little break here and you come back in part two.